how could we better manage the water we already have so that we don't need to, at great expense, take water from elsewhere and others?
Hello, and welcome to the Water Buffs podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Tobin, director of the Water Desk at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. I'm excited to be speaking today to Brad Lancaster, the subject of a new and fascinating documentary, Water Harvester: An Invitation to Abundance. This documentary was produced by David Fenster, a journalist at Arizona Public Media and one of our grantees.
I'd like to help create a system so I can abandon it and it'll thrive without me. The systems in our built environment are completely dependent on people and continuous inputs, and I find it draining. Whereas I can go out into the natural world and it's like, wow, I mean, look at what manifests, look at what grows from this. It's thriving just with what's freely at hand. And that's what really excites me.
Hey, I'm Brad Lancaster. It's raining, and I want to show you some water harvesting in action. Okay?
Boom! Brad lives in Tucson, Arizona, and he's the author of Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond, which explains how individuals and communities can harvest rainfall to stretch local supplies in arid environments. Since 1993, Brad has run a successful permaculture and regenerative design, consulting, and education business. At home, Brad, his brother, and his family harvest about 100,000 gallons of rainwater a year on a 1/8 acre urban lot in adjoining public right-of-way. You can learn more about Brad's work at harvestingrainwater.com and neighborhoodforesters.org. Welcome to the show, Brad. It's great to have you join us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
For starters, it would be great if you could explain a little bit about what water harvesting is, what the different approaches are, and why it's necessary.
Yeah. So water harvesting is basically taking advantage of your free on-site waters and trying to get them to linger longer into the dry season to minimize drought and also reduce flooding in wet times. So there's many different free on-site waters. There's rainwater, there's storm water, like say coming off the street. There's gray water from your household drains. There's air conditioning condensate. But let's start with what I consider the mother of all waters, rainwater. Okay, so there's two ways typically you can go about harvesting that rain. Typically, people's mind goes right to a tank. Okay, so if you're collecting water off your roof, it goes into a gutter. You can direct that via gravity into a tank from which you can dole out the water as needed. But that's the more expensive way to go because now you got to buy gutters, you got to buy a tank. However, it works great. And thanks to systems like that, I get 95% of my domestic water for drinking, cooking, bathing, so forth from tanked roof runoff. But the way I typically start, and what I advocate most people do, is to start with a passive rainwater harvesting system rather than an active system. Active is tanks, meaning someone has to actively turn on or off a valve of a tank for it to work. With a passive system, no one needs to be there if you set it up right. So that's within a passive system harvests water in these basin-like shapes in the ground or rain gardens. So when it rains, the basin fills up with water, and all the associated vegetation then accesses that water, and the vegetation acts as the living pump, pumping that water into its tissue, into its fruit. So you then enjoy the water in the form of the shade, the shelter, the fruit, the wildlife habitat, the beauty, fragrance, and so forth. And even if you're going to do a tank system, you still need the passive system, okay? Because you need to direct that overflow water somewhere, and instead of just unconsciously sending it somewhere where it might become a nuisance or a problem, try and consciously use that overflow water as yet another resource. So I direct my tank overflow water into rain gardens. So I'm getting yet another use. I'm trying to mimic the planet's hydrologic cycle. of cycling water myriad times, again and again and again, in a way that doesn't reduce its quality, but at least maintains it or even enhances it with each cycle.
Hmm. So you live in Tucson. Is rainwater harvesting applicable in other places, or does there have to be a certain special kind of climate and hydrology for it to work well?
So anywhere in the world that there is a dry season or there is occasionally drought, that absolutely makes sense to harvest rainwater. And all around the world where you have those conditions of either having a dry season or occasionally experiencing drought, you will find that the traditional cultures of that place have a rich history of water harvesting. Now, unfortunately, very often that history was forgotten when we got, about 100 years ago or so, mechanical pumps that could pump water from greater distances or greater depths in the groundwater table. So when that perceived modern convenience came online, oftentimes people started to forget and stop to practicing those traditional systems. But I found throughout my studies and research that these traditional systems are becoming more important yet again because they help recharge the aquifers, the groundwater tables, the springs, the creeks, the rivers. So while we have these mechanical pumps that can move water, the source of water that they are tapping or accessing is quickly being depleted because we've stopped practicing these traditional water harvesting practices that help recharge those water sources. So it's cool to see it coming back.
Hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating in Arizona, the history of the Tohono O'odham, the Hohokam, their tradition of harvesting rainwater and using that to be able to survive in the desert. Where are some other places in the United States where water harvesting and rainwater harvesting would work especially well? Are there certain states or places? You mentioned a dry season, but are there certain areas in particular?
Yeah, so let's jump outside of the dry environment, where I'm at here in Tucson, where we get 11 inches of rain a year. So it makes a lot of sense in New Orleans. So especially after Katrina and the big flooding there, a lot of the readers of my book wrote me letters of gratitude because while many of their neighbors were surrounded by water, they had no drinking water because there was so much contamination of the water due to the flood and various contaminants that got into those floodwater flows. So there's a different example. Another example would be in Portland, Oregon, where they direct their rainwater and stormwater into the same pipes that receive everybody's sewage. So it's a combined sewer overflow, CSO they call it. So the sewer pipe gets rainwater, stormwater, and sewage. So what happens in a really big rain event is something quite unpleasant, is you basically have turds floating up in people's basement drains. And that's horrible, that's heinous, but it's also fantastic because nothing drives political will like a brown trout floating up into your basement drain or coming out the street storm drain into the street. So people call up mayor and council and they say, I don't care what it takes, get these turds out of my basement and get them off my street. So this sparked a whole shift in how Portland, Oregon manages its water. Because initially they were looking at expanding the pipes to increase their capacity, but the cost was huge. It was unaffordable. So they looked at, well, what if we instead infiltrated the rain as close as possible to the surface it initially touches so that it never even gets to the storm drain, or at least far less of it gets to the storm drain. Then perhaps we can use our existing pipes and we don't need to expand. So they looked at creating a whole lot of rain gardens and whatnot, and they prioritized the neighborhoods that had the highest turd to basement drain ratio. Okay, so in these neighborhoods that used to have a bad reputation for those flooding issues, now are some of the more sought after neighborhoods because they're so much more beautiful with these rain gardens in their streets, along the streets. So it's much more shaded, and beautiful and whatnot. So in one neighborhood alone, they were able to reduce the cost of the stormwater control by, I believe it was $58 million, while at the same time creating all these amazing amenities for the folks living in that neighborhood. Yeah, so there can be many different drivers. It can be perceived lack of water. It can be water quality or lack of good water quality. It can be flooding, and more. So I basically find this works just about anywhere in the world. Maybe the Arctic, maybe not. That's the only place I'm not sure of.
Right. Well, here in Colorado, it was actually illegal until recently to harvest rainwater. I think the gist of the justification for that was by you harvesting rainwater, you're depriving of somebody downstream of their water supply. They did change the law, but I'm wondering if that's an issue policy-wise that is a potential obstacle to doing this.
Yeah, I definitely find that the biggest barrier to water harvesting is a lack of direct experience with it and an understanding of what it's really about. That was the case in Colorado, where it was thought that if people harvested, say, their roof runoff, they'd be denying people downstream of water that would otherwise hit the creek and make it into downstream areas. But that was proven wrong by 𝘞𝘢𝘵𝘬𝘳, an engineer based in the Denver area, who was hired by a developer that wanted to build a housing development south of Denver in Douglas County, and was going to use rainwater as the primary water source for those homes, collecting water off the roof. So she went out to the site pre-development, so it had not been bladed, it had the existing vegetation in it and whatnot, and she found in an undeveloped, unpaved site, in a typical rain event, no more than 3% of the rainfall will run off site. Okay, will leave the site. 97% of that moisture will infiltrate and be used by on-site vegetation and soil life. So then she did computer modeling. She said, well, what if we had some biblical event with incredible amount of rain, the potential for more flooding and runoff? Found that in that condition, no more than 15% of the precipitation would leave the site. The rest would infiltrate and be utilized by the ecology on site. So taking that information to the state legislature, the law was changed. So although there's something a little bit arbitrary with how they changed it, in my opinion. So if you are not hooked up to the water grid, so you're not hooked up to the city water supply or the city sewer, you can harvest rainwater in tanks, no problem. Okay, big tanks. But if you are hooked up to the water grid, you are limited to just 100-gallon capacity of tanks. I find that arbitrary. Because that means most of the people in the urban environment are limited by much smaller tanks. But in my opinion, in the urban environment, water harvesting makes a lot more sense and is much more needed, because there's so much of the urban environment has been paved over. So now we have artificially astronomically high runoff volumes, causing flooding downstream, erosion, and creating the need to, at great expenditure, pump water from elsewhere to replace the water we wastefully drained away. So I see improvement, room for improvement there.
Mm-hmm. In the documentary, we see a project adjusting how curbs are laid out in order to allow water to infiltrate the soil and help plants rather than just run down the street. Tell us a little bit about, from a public works perspective, what you can do in order to harvest rainwater.
Yeah, so something that I've been very inspired by in the city of Portland and the city of Seattle were city-driven initiatives to cut the street curb to direct street runoff into street side plantings and also in-street plantings, say traffic calming strategies that also harvested water. A lot of these strategies are part of those rain garden efforts I mentioned earlier in Portland, Oregon, that reduced their need to increase flood control pipes or conveyance pipes. So inspired by that, I came back to Tucson and thought, okay, well, we can do it here, but there was no, at the time, it was illegal, or I prefer the term pre-legal, to cut the curb to direct street runoff into street side plantings. You could cut the curb to send water to the street, but just not take it off the street. So since that was pre-legal, my brother and I did the work on a Sunday morning when no one from the city was watching. We started small with just one installation at the top of the watershed, so there was a low volume of water, and the chance of there being a problem was very low. We only did one, then worked through the issues that arose, and after perfecting it, moved on down. Neighbors saw how well this worked. They wanted to do likewise. Our trees were growing much faster and they were much more lush than theirs. And we did not water our trees while they did water their trees. So we approached the city. And what I think enabled us to get over initial fears with the city and to get it legalized, and not just legalized, but also incentivized with up to a $2,000 rebate, and mandated in new road construction and major road renovation. So 180-degree flip from what it used to be. And I think what enabled that flip was they could see the effects, the results of this, and how well it was working. Also, we had the advantage that the cities of Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington had done this. So other municipalities had done it. That dropped their fear threshold. And we also had a great ally in the city, Frank Sousa, who used to head up the flood control department. And he had taken photos of dozens of sites around town where there were unconscious or unplanned street runoff harvesting happening. Like maybe a curb, a raised street curb was never fully constructed and there was an opening and water was pooling and infiltrating beside the road and growing vegetation. So he brought that in, and that really helped address a lot of the engineers' fears. And the other thing that really helped is when we started the meetings with the city, we weren't just trying to push to legalize curb cuts. We asked the city, what issues are you experiencing along neighborhood streets? Because perhaps we could help you address those issues. So it was excessive crime, excessive flooding, litter, a lot of potholes from the asphalt vaporizing in the heat and from flooding of the streets, and other things. So we said, okay, great. We think we can help you address these issues you're already experiencing. If we pull water off the street with the curb cut, we can reduce the flooding. That'll reduce potholes. If we use the runoff coming off the street to grow street trees irrigated for free just with the runoff from the street, we can shade and cool the street. That'll reduce the vaporization of the asphalt and thereby reduce potholes. If we involve the community, get neighbors to do this, as we've been doing in our neighborhood, then you get neighbors getting to know each other. So there's more friendly eyes on the street. Then crime drops. And as they steward the plantings, they're also picking up the litter. So it was just win, 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 win. And of course, we're getting more of those wins by consciously trying to address all of those things as we evolved the design of these systems and their implementation by working with the city. I just want to give you one other little statistic that I forgot. So in Tucson, Arizona, where we just get 11 inches of rain a year, the average residential neighborhood street drains over 1 million gallons of runoff per mile per year. And if that water is directed to street side and in-street plantings as opposed to a storm drain, that's enough water to freely irrigate one tree every 25 feet on both sides of the street. Or basically, it's enough water to create a continuous shade canopy along both sides of every street. Okay, and you get a bigger street, you've got even more water. So a huge potential there, while reducing the heat island effect and heat-related illnesses and the effects of climate change and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you think of an urban environment and a big rainstorm, in a place like Tucson, the streets often flood. There's not really a storm sewer system in most places. What about the water quality? I mean, if you think of kind of all the stuff that's on a street, motor oil and chemicals, does that pose a problem in terms of water quality and contamination?
We have found that there is no problem for the health of the plants. The vegetation is fine with it. And what's more, we have found that the soil life helps bioremediate or naturally filter those toxins. So we worked with researchers at the University of Arizona, such as Mitch 𝘞𝘢𝘗𝘓, and he found that in our street side water harvesting basins, there were elevated populations of diverse soil life that helped bioremediate these toxins. And what helped even further is the way we were harvesting water. So we don't use rock or gravel in these basins. We're using organic matter like leaf drop, wood chip mulch, which enhances the habitat for these beneficial soil life and also helps with that bioremediation of the potential toxins. And another point is we need to keep in mind, we're talking about neighborhood streets. We're not talking about industrial strips of mechanics. Okay, so the amount of toxins is much less than you might find in other contexts. And then the other piece is that we are continually working to enhance the life forms within our street side and in-street water harvesting interventions to enhance that bioremediation ability. And we don't plant annual crops like leafy greens or lettuces in there because you don't want something you're going to eat raw coming into contact with that. So leafy greens, vegetables, that's grown on private property with roof runoff because nobody's parking on your roof and no cows or anything are getting up there. So you don't have the fecal matter issue on a roof that you might have on a ground level surface. And we do plant food-bearing plants like woody perennials, but many studies have found that the toxins, if absorbed, are typically uptaken in the woody part of the plant, not the reproductive part, not the edible part. So it's right plant in right place.
Quick break here to remind you that Water Buffs is a production of The Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. Learn more about water issues and download free water-related multimedia at waterdesk.org. You can find the audio version of this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. The video version is available on YouTube and Vimeo. If you'd like to send us a comment or question or suggestion for the podcast, email us at waterdesk@colorado.edu. You can also find the Water Desk on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'm 𝘞𝘢𝘲 Myers, executive producer and co-director of the Water Buffs podcast, and I invite you to check out some of our other episodes. And special thanks to the rest of the Water Buffs team. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the rest of the show.
So we've been talking about putting rainwater to use, but water harvesting is much bigger than that. It's not just about rainwater. There's greywater, for instance. Tell us a little bit about the other different approaches to water harvesting.
Sure. So greywater is the lightly used water that goes down the drains of your sink, showers, bathtub, and washing machine. I'm not talking about toilet water. That's a different thing. Okay, there's much more stuff in there we need to be concerned about. So that's called black water, not gray water. It turns out in Tucson, the average single-family household, the amount of gray water they send down their drain is close to, not quite, but it's close to meeting all their outdoor water demands. So if that gray water were directed to plantings in the landscape, as opposed to the sewer or the septic tank, they'd have the majority of their irrigation needs met with water they've already paid for. But instead of just sending it down the drain after, light use of washing the hands, let's send it to the landscape. So great potential there. And then to make up the difference, the shortfall, that's where rainwater can take care of the rest. Another thing is air conditioning condensate. So if folks have air conditioners and they're running them, the cold coil on the air conditioning unit, atmospheric moisture will condense on it. And so if folks have experienced an air conditioner, especially in a humid time of year, that it's constantly dripping at the drain. So you can direct that to the landscape as opposed to sending it to the sewer. And that's basically distilled water. And if you want to tap a dark gray water, that would be your kitchen sink water. Okay, it's not as easy to utilize as gray water from other drains because there's more organic matter at the kitchen sink. So you just have to take some slightly elevated levels of precaution. All very manageable, very easy to do. And you'll find you have far more earthworms with your dark gray water from the kitchen sink than other water sources because they love that kitchen sink juice water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember in Tucson, a lot of people would just simply take the hose from their washer and put it outside. That seems pretty simple.
Yeah.
But obviously, like replumbing your house would be a much bigger endeavor. Although it seems like there's an increasing number of homes and businesses that are being built up front with the capacity to use gray water, which I'm sure is much easier than retrofitting it.
Correct. And in fact, the city of Tucson now has an ordinance that in all new home construction or renovation, say putting on an addition with a bathroom, you have to include a gray water harvesting stub out. Now, what that is, it's the pipe in your wall and floor that will direct the gray water out to the landscape if you choose to hook up to it. Okay, it's already in your wall and floor, and this saves a lot of money because if you have to jackhammer a wall or floor to put in that pipe, that's going to cost a lot more money. So I think that's a huge improvement, and you can get a rebate for up to $1,000 for doing a gray water harvesting system in Tucson. All great stuff, but I want to point out that while Tucson's ahead of the game with a number of these things, we have not gone far enough, and we need to further evolve these ordinances. So one shortfalling of our gray water stub out ordinance, that's the one putting your gray water plumbing in the walls and the floor at the time of construction, is the ordinance does not clearly state that you have to mark that. So it is very easy for the next owner or user of that home to find that stub out. Okay, you got to make it. Unfortunately, right now, the ordinance is made very easy for the builder, but not easy and convenient for the homeowner. And that we need to improve.
Mm-hmm.
Always room to improve and evolve.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there are policy measures like these ordinances, as well as financial incentives, rebates that can promote this and incentivize it, and help spread the practice.
Yeah, and we've got to do this. I mean, with the dropping level in the reservoirs of Lake Mead and Lake Powell, and the extreme overallocation of the dwindling Colorado River, we've got to much better manage our free on-site waters. And it's frustrating for me to hear of all the bickering and whatnot amongst the Western states of, who needs to conserve more, all pointing fingers at each other, as opposed to looking at oneself and say, well, how could we better manage the water we already have so that we don't need to, at great expense, take water from elsewhere and others? In fact, I think we should be striving, and this is what I do in my personal life and my brother and his family do, we strive to give back more to the system on a daily basis than we take from it. So by giving back more than you take, things get better over time, not just for us, but for the entire community, the entire watershed. I think that's how we should be managing our water. How can we better collaborate with these living systems that enable life to be in the first place? And I see that all too often we are managing our municipal waters as by ever withdrawing more water from our savings account. So I see two accounts. You got your savings account, you got your checking account. The savings account, you shouldn't touch that until there's an extreme, true time of need. Okay, you save it for that time of need. You don't use it on a daily basis, because if you use it on a daily basis, there won't be anything saved for that time of need. So I see Colorado River water, groundwater, should be our savings account water. Whereas our free on-site waters, that we can spend freely on a daily basis. That's the checking account water. So our rainwater, our stormwater, our street runoff, our gray water, our air conditioning condensate, our dark gray water, all those, that's checking account water that we can use on a daily basis. And if we start to set up conditions in our lives now that we are very well practiced and familiar with using those free on-site waters, the checking account as opposed to the savings account, we will have savings, and learning and all that. There's no stress behind it. If we wait to make that shift until there's no savings, that's going to be a very stressful shift. But if you do it now, it's not stressful. It's very joyous. It's a great thing to learn. And my spirit's lifted as I see the health of the vegetation in our landscape steadily improving, and my water bill not going up at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we talked about contamination with rainwater. Are there also water quality concerns with gray water? I mean, we're not using toilet water, to be clear, but still, water from a washer, from a sink, people bathing, that could have potentially contaminants. How do you manage that?
Yeah, so let me backtrack a slight bit, and I'll come back to that. So when we're talking about rainwater quality, we're actually talking about street runoff quality, not rainwater. So rainwater is much cleaner than the runoff after the rain has hit a surface over which it's been running. So the toxins with street runoff are on the street; they're not in the air. If you're in an area with a lot of industrial air contamination, okay, you want to look at the quality of your rainwater. But if it's relatively clean, you should be fine in terms of your rainwater quality. There is an elementary school here in Tucson, Monzo Elementary, which has incorporated rainwater harvesting into their curriculum. So they have the students do the math to figure out how much rain would come off the different roof areas of the classrooms, and then they size their tanks appropriately. And they were using this water to direct to garden plantings that grew vegetables that they would then send to their school cafeteria. So the school district got concerned about stormwater quality and tried to ban the use of those plants, those vegetables grown with rainwater in the cafeteria, without any data to back up that decision. So thankfully, school staff jumped right on it. They got a graduate student to do the research and found that there was no problem at all. So very typically your rainwater is going to be your highest quality water source, the direct rainfall, because it's naturally distilled water. Now let's switch to gray water, as you were asking about, that water that goes down your sink, shower, bathtub drain, and washing machine drain. So there, the main issue is going to be the soaps and detergents and cleansers that you use. So don't use chlorinated bleach. If you want to use bleach, use hydrogen peroxide bleach, but the chlorinated bleach kills your plants and soil life. And you basically want to use liquid soaps as opposed to bar or powdered soaps, because in the Western United States, we need to watch out for too much salt. Okay. And typically, powdered detergents, they use salt-based material to make it seem like you're getting more for your money. So most of what's in that box of powdered detergent isn't detergent. It's filler material and typically high in salt. So by using liquid soaps, you get less of that. On the gray water harvesting page of my website and in my books, I give far more information of what soaps are good, what's not so good, and how to make wiser choices. So the website being harvestingrainwater.com. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when we talked about rainwater, mentioned how there had been a ban on harvesting it in Colorado, concerns about impacts on downstream users. With gray water, if less water is going down the drain at your house and at other houses, and less water is going to the sewage treatment plant, does that create any challenges? For instance, in places like Arizona, effluent from wastewater treatment plants supports riparian areas and vegetation. Are there any downstream impacts if more and more people do a better job of using water on their property rather than sending it down the drain?
Well, about 30% of the water going down the drain in a typical household is toilet water. We're not talking about touching that toilet water, okay? And the other thing is a lot of these riparian areas, we could be enhancing them just as we are in the built environment with these water harvesting strategies. We don't need to be reliant on effluent to enhance our riparian areas. It certainly doesn't need to be the sole source or primary source. And let me tie into something on that also addresses the concern that Colorado has and others have, wondering about if we use too much rainwater, are we robbing water from others downstream. So I studied a site, the 𝘐𝘯𝘷𝘪𝘵𝘢𝘗𝘢 Ranch in southeastern Arizona, where they put in 20,000 loose rock dams. These dams are no higher than 3 feet. Oftentimes they're only 1 foot high. And they're like speed humps perpendicular to the flow of the creek, an ephemeral creek. It did not flow year-round when they started this work. So they put in over 20,000 of these structures to slow down and spread out the water. So instead of it ever cutting the channel deeper, they made the channel shallower and spread the water over more of the floodplain. So there's more soil-water contact and enabling the water to infiltrate and get banked in the soil at the times of high flood flow, which reduced flooding downstream and reduced erosion. And then that water was slowly released, not over the surface, but subsurface, and then would eventually feed the flow of the creek. And so when they started this work, their ranching neighbors downstream were very alarmed and concerned that this was going to reduce the creek flow and also drop their well levels. The opposite was the reality. After they did this work, their neighbors downstream all found that their groundwater levels rose because of the amount of water being banked into the watershed by their neighbors above. And they did find that the flood flows were reduced, but the creek flowed much longer into the dry season than it had before. So instead of 3 months of flow, they're getting 9 months of flow. Dramatic difference. No one was complaining once they figured that out. So we can apply, it doesn't have to be check dams, there's many other strategies, but all that similarly slow and infiltrate the flow of water, this can also help boost our riparian ecosystems. We don't have to be entirely reliant on effluent.
Mm-hmm. So if a homeowner is interested in getting started in water harvesting, what would be your advice? It seems like there are a lot of different options to choose from.
Yeah, my advice would be get out there when it's raining. Go outside. Don't stay inside. Go outside and see how the water flows. See where it too quickly flows off-site, maybe causing erosion and being lost. That's not working. You got to shift that. Where is the water maybe gathering and supporting vegetation? You got more life. That's probably more what you want to be mimicking. Okay, and then you figure out, well, where do we not have water but we need water, and then try and redirect some to those areas. So at a minimum, an easy thing I like to do is to grow more of a shade canopy with trees on the east and west sides of my house, so they shade it from the hot summer rising and setting sun. And that can dramatically reduce my cooling bills at the same time. I would not recommend these. Typically, I don't recommend people start with tanks. Start with the rain gardens, the earthworks. If you got a small yard, do it on the periphery. So you're working off an existing barrier of a fence line or a property line. And then the vegetation that you grow in those peripheral basins will help diffuse the view of the fence line. It'll make your yard feel larger. And then after you've done that, then maybe look at doing the gray water, which can be directed to the same rain gardens you created. But you maybe look at that gray water before you look in a tank, because a tank tends to be one of the more expensive options. So after you've maximized your passive rain garden, rainwater harvesting, and your gray water harvesting into same rain gardens, then look into a tank. That's typically the way I'd go about it.
Mm-hmm. Great. That's really helpful. And again, folks can check out harvestingrainwater.com and neighborhoodforesters.org for more advice from Brad. Anything else that you want to add?
Yeah. Sometimes people say to me, they go, hey, why are you putting so much emphasis on harvesting these free on-site waters in the residential context? Aren't we consuming more water in the agricultural context or the industrial context? So to that I say, well, I've got lots of examples in my books on website of how to harvest free on-site waters in the agricultural setting. That ranch I mentioned earlier was one. But I think what is essential is that everyone in all contexts start harvesting water as close as possible to where it falls, where they live, work, and play. That way, we have a real life experience and understanding of how one can conserve and make changes. So, so often we just go right to saying, well, others should do this without looking at how we ourselves could do it. And I truly believe, and have talked with a number of policymakers, that become better policymakers when they do this in their own life, even if some of the policy that they are working on is in different contexts, because they have a better lived experience of how to do this. And very often, these approaches, they can jump or bridge different contexts. They can also scale up. So it's essential, I think, that we educate ourselves through a lived experience, and to strive to have a lived experience that is joyous and convenient. So I strive to make it easier to harvest rainwater and gray water than it is to use virgin city water. So the faucet for my garden, in the middle of my vegetable garden, goes to the rainwater tank. I have to walk outside of the garden and a fair distance to get to the city tap. So it is much more convenient to use the rainwater. I'm incentivized to do the right thing than it is to do the thing I don't want to do. It used to be the opposite. I used to have the city faucet closer to the garden, and my cisterns were always full. I wasn't using the water, and I was like, "What's going on? This is my life, and I'm not using the rainwater." And then I realized I had not set it up conveniently enough to use the rainwater. So I flipped the whole thing around. And now rainwater is the water I use, and it's a great joy to use it. And that, if I had not put myself into that experience of having the lived experience, I would not have made that realization. I would have not have made that change. And that's why I think it's so important to have this lived experience and to continually strive to make it better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Thank you so much, Brad. This has been really fascinating. I'd encourage folks to check out your website and your resources, as well as the documentary from Arizona Public Media and David Fenster. It's a really interesting look at water, and I think it will open your eyes as to how we might use these resources more wisely.
Yeah,
thanks very much.
David did a great job. And check out the books, Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond.
Yes, great resources, so please check them out. Thanks a lot, Brad.
Yeah, thank you.